2,000 years ago, a child was born in a manger in Bethlehem, and that singular event, that historical singularity, you could call it, changed the world. It created, of course, the Christian religion, but Christianity is not a religion in quite the same way as other religions. Now, if you look at the great religions of the world, they have things in common. They have a common morality, and that's very significant. If you look at the monotheistic religions, they believe in one God, and I think it has to be the same God, even if that same God is described or even named differently. And yet, in other ways, religions are not the same. Christianity, for example, has the concept of the martyr, of martyrdom, which goes right to the early Christians. And this is a concept that you find in Christianity and in Islam, by the way, but you don't find it in Judaism. You don't find it in Hinduism. You don't find it in Buddhism. And if you look at the Christian and Islamic concepts of the martyr, they're very different. I mean, for a lot of radical Muslims, a Muslim 23-year-old who blows himself up in an Israeli cafe and takes like 10 Israelis with him is a martyr. Why? Because he's doing a jihad, he's striking a blow, if you will, for Allah. But the Christian concept of the martyr is totally different. In the Christian concept, the martyr voluntarily gives up his or her own life rather than renounce or rather than reject the God and Jesus. Now, Debbie and I watched, this was a few weeks ago, a documentary on C.S. Lewis, a very interesting documentary in many ways. But one comment jumped out at me. Lewis was talking about just sitting outside in a cafe and watching people kind of mill about. And this is me talking, not Lewis, but when you see people walking on the street, there are kind of different ways to look at them, right? One way, if you're kind of a radical materialist, is you go, hey, there's a bunch of carbon life forms. There's a bunch of molecules and that have essentially assembled themselves into arms and legs and neurons. And all we're looking is at material objects that have somehow sprung to consciousness through some kind of blind evolutionary process. That's one way to look at it. That's the materialist outlook. Another way to look at it is these are human beings. And what we know about them is that they're born, they live, and one day they will die. And that's what we're looking at. We're looking at temporary beings who inhabit the world for a short period of time. But the Christian view, and this is the view that C.S. Lewis was expressing, is he goes, when I see people walking around, I see eternal beings. I see eternal beings that are here, you may say, on earth on a sort of pilgrimage, but it's not their ultimate destination. And Lewis's point is that looking at people that way gives you a totally different outlook. And I think what Lewis is talking about is a phrase I've used before on the podcast. It's subspecie aeternitatis. It's the idea of looking at things from the perspective of eternity. And this is a kind of, well, Nietzsche called it a revaluation of values, a kind of transformation of perspective. And so, for example, if you look at a guy who's incredibly successful, but, deep down he's kind of a mercenary, he's kind of a crook. From the earthly point of view, this guy's a winner because he's figured out the rules of life. He's playing them really well. But from the Christian point of view, you can't but be skeptical. For the Christian, the poor peasant who crawls to the altar on his knees, who is a failure by the world standards, is nevertheless someone who's preparing to receive a heavenly reward. So success is defined differently, subspecie aeternitatis. Christianity offers you, through this concept of eternity, a experience of the sublime. Now, if you're not a Christian, you can still experience the sublime, but it's very rare and it's very episodic. Some people feel that when listening to a symphony or sitting, by the lake with someone you love, you have that momentary experience of the sublime, but it's there and then it's gone, and then it's only recoverable through memories that themselves become more dimmed over time. But the beauty of Christianity is that it introduces the sublime it makes it an experience of ordinary life. And it does so because you begin to realize that everything, your work is a form of prayer. Your marriage is a weird kind of menage a trois. Why? Because God's a part of it. He's the third party in a successful marriage. And you begin to experience what Milton talks about his phrase is a paradise within thee, happier far. And what Milton means is that paradise isn't just simply a destination of the next world, some place that we're headed that we may get to someday, but paradise is a condition of the human soul that can be tasted, at least a foretaste of it, even in this life. And Christianity allows us to endure suffering and difficult circumstances which are not avoidable in life, but nevertheless do them with a sense of joy, without losing your joy. I remember years ago, there was a woman whose life was destroyed. I mean, essentially her family, her home was knocked down in a hurricane. One of her best friends had died in a brain tumor. And she's quoted in the paper saying this: "We're putting our lives in God's hands and trusting that He has our best interest at heart. I've clung to my faith more than ever this year. As a consequence, I haven't lost my joy." Now, it's that last phrase that really gets me. I haven't lost my joy. Well, humanly speaking, how is that possible? The sources of your joy appear to have been squashed, appear to have been taken away, and yet your joy remains. Why? Because your joy is ultimately coming not sort of from the world, but from the author of the world. It's coming really from God. It's coming from Christ. Christianity helps us to remember that when we're called not just to success, not just to happiness, but also to holiness. And holiness is really a state of mind. It is the way that your heart is oriented. It isn't simply what you do. It is sort of how you are. What counts for God isn't just our external conduct, but also our inward disposition. There's a phrase that is used by John the Baptist in the Bible. He's standing waist deep in the river, and he says of Christ, he goes, "He must increase and I must decrease." Now, on the face of it, this appears to be strange, this idea that here we are in the world and we're trying to somehow make ourselves decrease, and we're trying to increase the empire of Christ in our hearts. But this counterintuitive advice turns out to be the best advice of all. Why? Because it substitutes God's plan for our plan. As we give Christ a greater and greater domain in our hearts, we begin to experience God's love and God's peace. And this is, for me, the true message of the child in the manger.